The story of the Vought XF5U, later nicknamed the Flying Pancake, begins in the late 1930s and early 1940s when aviation engineers were searching for ways to dramatically improve the performance of carrier-based aircraft. The U.S. Navy faced a strategic challenge. It needed fighters that could operate from short carrier decks, climb rapidly to intercept enemy bombers, and still carry the fuel and weapons necessary for long patrols. Traditional aircraft design, with its clear separation between wings, fuselage, and tail, was approaching aerodynamic limits. A new approach was needed if the Navy was to gain a decisive technological advantage. One of the most ambitious ideas came from Charles H. Zimmerman, an aeronautical engineer whose work focused on unconventional wing designs. Zimmerman, employed by Vought, had been exploring concepts that combined the lifting body of an aircraft with propeller systems integrated directly into the wings. His philosophy emphasized discoidal designs, flattened, broad structures where nearly the entire aircraft contributed to lift. The intent was to achieve exceptional low-speed handling and very short takeoff and landing performance without sacrificing high-speed flight characteristics. This was of particular interest to the Navy, which struggled with the problem of carrier aircraft needing both compact dimensions and superior performance. Zimmerman's concepts first took physical shape in a series of scale prototypes known as the Vought V173. Built largely of wood and fabric, the V173 made its maiden flight in 1942 and quickly earned the nickname Flying Pancake due to its odd, flat, disc-like appearance. Despite its unconventional looks, the V173 displayed promising characteristics. Pilots reported that it could take off after only a few hundred feet of ground roll, practically leaping into the air. Its unusual wing body shape provided massive lift, and with its twin propellers mounted at the wingtips, the entire structure seemed capable of harnessing airflow in ways traditional aircraft could not. The Navy observed these tests with great interest at a time when conventional carrier fighters like the Grumman F4F Wildcat and F6F Hellcat were in service, and the Vought F4U Corsair was being prepared for widespread deployment. The idea of a radically new fighter design held strong appeal. The Pacific War emphasized the importance of interceptors that could climb quickly to meet enemy bombers, and long-range fighters that could escort carrier strike groups. Zimmerman and his team argued that a production-ready version of the Flying Pancake could outperform conventional fighters by combining agility, endurance, and short-field performance in one package. By 1943, the Navy approved the construction of a full-scale, combat-oriented prototype based on the V-173's principles. This new design, designated the XF5U-1, was to be built from metal and equipped with powerful radial engines that would drive large, counter-rotating propellers. Unlike the V-173's modest wooden airframe and relatively low power plant, the XF5U would be a serious combat aircraft, expected to rival or exceed the performance of contemporary fighters. It was to be heavily armed with machine guns or cannons mounted in the fuselage, and capable of both high-speed interception and slow-speed carrier landings. The development challenges, however, were immense. Translating the experimental wooden V-173 into a robust, combat-ready fighter required significant redesign. Engineers had to address structural integrity, vibration control, and the efficient transmission of power from the engines to the oversized propellers. The peculiar shape also created maintenance concerns, as much of the aircraft's mass was distributed across its wide body rather than concentrated in a conventional fuselage. Weight was a constant issue. Early calculations suggested that the XF5U risked being far heavier than intended, potentially undermining its short-field performance advantage. Nevertheless, the Navy and Vought pressed forward. The XF5U project embodied both the urgency and the optimism of wartime aviation research. At a time when German engineers were experimenting with jets and flying wings, and Japanese designers were producing lightweight, high maneuverability fighters, the United States was exploring whether unconventional aerodynamics could redefine naval aviation. The Flying Pancake was not just an oddity, it was part of a global competition to break free from established patterns and find the next breakthrough in air combat technology. In its origins, therefore, the XF5U represented a daring response to pressing strategic needs. It promised to solve the Navy's carrier aircraft problem by delivering extraordinary low-speed control, near-vertical takeoff capability, and combat performance equal to or greater than existing fighters. More than just an experiment, it was conceived as a potential production aircraft, a frontline fighter that might reshape naval aviation. Its unusual appearance belied serious intent, marking the start of a journey that would test the limits of engineering and the patience of military planners. The transition from the wooden V-173 to the metal-built XF5U was anything but simple. While the early prototype had demonstrated that the basic Pancake concept could fly, scaling the design up into a rugged, combat-ready aircraft presented engineers with new challenges that had no precedent in conventional fighter development. Construction of the first full-scale XF5U prototype began in 1943 at the Vought factory in Stratford, Connecticut. Unlike the lightweight V-173, which had relied on wood and fabric, the XF5U would employ all-metal construction to withstand the stresses of carrier operations and combat. This meant that every structural component had to be reimagined to maintain rigidity without adding excessive weight, a problem made worse by the unusual wide, flat shape of the airframe. Power was to be supplied by two Pratt & Whitney R2000 radial engines, each producing 350 horsepower, embedded deep within the airframe and connected to enormous 16-foot propellers at the wingtips through a complex gearbox and shaft system. These counter-rotating propellers were critical to Zimmermann's concept, as they were expected to harness airflow across the entire lifting body and eliminate torque problems associated with large single-propeller aircraft. In theory, this setup would allow the XF5U to combine the short field performance of the V-173 with speeds approaching 450 miles per hour, on par with the best conventional fighters of the time. But engineering such a transmission system introduced delays and difficulties. The shafts running from the engines to the propellers had to be synchronized perfectly, and any imbalance could create destructive vibration across the wide, flat frame. The unique structure also demanded specialized landing gear, retractable into small bays within the broad wings rather than into a narrow fuselage. These modifications took time, and by 1944, while other fighter programs were entering mass production and combat service, the XF5U remained on the ground in assembly stages. Wind tunnel tests conducted during this period suggested that the design still held promise. Data indicated that the aircraft would indeed have unusually high lift at low speeds and would remain controllable even near stall conditions. This reassured the Navy that the Pancake might solve the perennial problem of short carrier takeoff and landing distances. Flight tests of the smaller V-173, which continued into 1943 and 1944, reinforced this optimism. The wooden prototype demonstrated remarkable handling, capable of landing at speeds as low as 40 miles per hour and taking off in incredibly short distances. Pilots reported that it could hover against strong headwinds and execute maneuvers that seemed impossible for conventional fighters. The hope was that these traits would scale up to the heavier, combat-equipped XF5U. Yet the growing weight of the metal design remained a constant concern. Engineers wrestled with structural reinforcements, added armament provisions, and the installation of military radios and equipment. Each modification pushed the projected weight higher, threatening to erase the performance gains promised by the radical layout. Moreover, while conventional fighters like the F-4U Corsair were already proving themselves in combat, the XF-5U consumed resources without producing a usable aircraft. The Navy tolerated the delays only because of the project's potential, but expectations began to shift as the war progressed. By the end of 1944, the XF-5U was still unfinished, while the pace of aviation technology was accelerating. Jet propulsion was rapidly advancing, and the first American jet fighters were already undergoing trials. Against this backdrop, the promise of a piston-driven aircraft, no matter how innovative, seemed increasingly uncertain. The Navy nonetheless authorized continued work, hoping at minimum that the data gathered from testing would justify the investment. The first completed XF5U prototype was ready for ground testing in 1945, after the end of the war in the Pacific. Initial taxi trials revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the design. The aircraft displayed stable ground handling, aided by its wide stance and low profile, but the mechanical complexity of its transmission system required constant attention. Vibrations and maintenance issues plagued early runs, delaying flight testing. Engineers worked to refine the gearbox system and fine-tune the propeller synchronization, but each adjustment required time and resources that were becoming harder to justify in the immediate post-war environment. Despite these difficulties, pilots remained eager to see the aircraft fly. Its predecessor, the V-173, had impressed everyone who tested it, from Navy aviators to civilian pilots like Charles Lindbergh. The XF5U promised to combine that extraordinary low-speed ability with the high-speed performance of a frontline fighter. In 1946, preparations were made for the first flight of the metal Pancake, but bureaucratic hesitation and persistent technical issues caused repeated postponements. By then, the Navy's priorities were shifting toward jets, and the XF5U was becoming less a candidate for service and more an experimental curiosity. Thus, the prototype and testing phase of the XF5U was marked by a paradox. The aircraft embodied radical thinking and showed genuine potential, but its technical difficulties, long delays, and the rapid pace of jet development overshadowed it. While the V-173 had proven the concept could fly, the full-scale XF5U lingered on the ground, its destiny hanging in uncertainty as the future of aviation left piston-driven innovation behind. As the XF5U program moved into the post-war years, the possibility of the aircraft entering operational service grew increasingly remote. The war had ended in 1945 before the metal Pancake could be completed and flown, and by then the U.S. Navy's focus had shifted sharply toward jet-powered aircraft. Nevertheless, Vought and its engineers continued to promote the XF5U as a potential carrier-based fighter, arguing that its unique design still offered advantages that no conventional airframe could match. The envisioned role of the XF5U within the Navy was clear. It was designed as a versatile carrier fighter, capable of defending fleets from enemy bombers, intercepting high-speed aircraft, and conducting long-range patrols when necessary. Its extraordinarily short takeoff and landing characteristics promised to reduce the operational demands on carrier decks, making it ideal for smaller escort carriers as well as the larger fleet carriers. In theory, the Pancake could scramble quickly to intercept incoming threats and return safely even to cramped carrier decks. Its powerful armament, expected to include 6 50-caliber machine guns or a combination of machine guns and 20mm cannons, would have given it formidable firepower comparable to, or exceeding, the Corsair and Hellcat. The Navy initially entertained the idea of limited production should the XF5U prove successful. Projections suggested that if the prototype validated its performance claims, Vought might receive orders to produce a frontline version designated F5U-1 for squadron service. These aircraft could have supplemented existing Corsairs and Hellcats, filling a niche role where their short field performance was especially valuable. The broader expectation was that they could act as high-altitude interceptors and point defense fighters, bridging the gap between traditional piston designs and the coming generation of jets. However, operational evaluations never materialized. The XF5U's long delays meant that by the time it was ready for serious testing, the Navy had already invested heavily in jet programs like the McDonnell FH Phantom and the North American FJ Fury. Jets promised speeds and climb rates that piston-driven aircraft could no longer achieve, making it difficult to justify the Pancake's continued development. Even if the XF5U had met its projected 450 mph top speed, this was already below the capabilities of emerging jet fighters. The Navy's leadership was reluctant to dedicate resources to a radical piston aircraft when jet propulsion represented the future of naval aviation. Test pilots and engineers who observed the XF5U during ground runs acknowledged its promise, but also recognized its limitations. While the design's low-speed handling seemed excellent, questions remained about its high-speed stability, maneuverability, and maintainability. The transmission system, with its long shafts and gearboxes, required constant attention, and there were doubts about whether the design could withstand the rigors of carrier service under combat conditions. Maintenance crews accustomed to conventional radial fighters would have faced entirely new challenges in keeping the Pancake operational. The Navy's growing disinterest was reflected in its allocation of resources. By 1946 and 1947, funding for piston-driven experimental fighters was dwindling, and emphasis was placed instead on testing jet prototypes and refining carrier operations for high-performance jet aircraft. The XF5U lingered as an engineering project rather than an operational prospect, confined largely to the hangars and test facilities at Vought. No squadron integration, deployment trials, or pilot training programs were initiated, leaving the aircraft with no path into service. By the late 1940s, the XF5U was essentially an orphan project. It had been designed to serve a wartime navy that no longer existed, its potential combat role undermined by both technological progress and changing strategic priorities. Although it never flew in combat, the very fact that it was seriously considered for operational deployment illustrates how ambitious the U.S. Navy was in seeking innovative solutions during the Second World War. The XF5U was not canceled because it lacked vision, but because history had moved beyond it. In its absence from service, the XF5U joined a long list of experimental aircraft that were conceived for roles they would never fulfill. Its operational chapter ended before it began, a victim of timing rather than concept alone. The Navy's interest in the Pancake faded as the jet age dawned, leaving the aircraft as a reminder of what might have been had the war lasted longer, or had piston fighters retained relevance just a few years more. When examining the combat potential of the Vought XF5U, it becomes clear that it was designed for missions it never had the opportunity to perform. Its disc-like layout was intended to combine agility at low speeds with the power to intercept high-performance enemy aircraft at altitude. Engineers envisioned it taking off from short carrier decks, climbing quickly into combat, and then returning with the precision of an aircraft that could nearly hover into a landing. In theory, this combination would have given the Navy a formidable tool for fleet defense. In reality, however, the aircraft never advanced far enough to validate these ambitions in actual combat trials. If deployed, the XF5U's primary mission would likely have been as a fleet interceptor. With its short takeoff run and wide lifting surface, it was expected to scramble faster than conventional fighters, an essential trait when responding to sudden bomber attacks against carrier groups. Armed with a proposed battery of machine guns or cannons, it would have been able to deliver concentrated firepower in quick, high-angle passes. Its ability to maintain control at unusually low speeds promised advantages in dogfights, where it might have performed tight maneuvers that conventional fighters could not match. There was also consideration of secondary missions. The broad lifting body of the Pancake could, in theory, carry additional fuel tanks or ordnance without degrading performance as drastically as in conventional fuselage designs. This raised the possibility of adapting the aircraft for strike missions or long patrols, though such roles were never formally tested. In a carrier environment, its ability to land at very low speeds would have reduced the risk of accidents, potentially allowing it to operate from smaller escort carriers where conventional aircraft faced greater limitations. Yet each of these envisioned roles remained speculative. Unlike aircraft such as the F-4U Corsair or F-6F Hellcat, which proved themselves in thousands of sorties across the Pacific, the XF5U was never subjected to combat evaluation. The lengthy delays in its development, combined with the Navy's pivot to jet technology, meant that it never reached the stage where its strengths and weaknesses could be measured in real-world missions. This left its potential unproven and its claims untested. One of the most significant obstacles to its operational adoption was maintenance. While theoretically combat-capable, the XF5U's complex drivetrain, two engines buried in the fuselage driving counter-rotating propellers via long transmission shafts, would have been difficult to sustain under wartime conditions. Combat units prized reliability and ease of repair, and the Pancake risked being too mechanically demanding for deployment to remote forward bases or small carriers operating under pressure. Even if its performance matched expectations, these practical limitations would likely have reduced its effectiveness in the field. Pilot reactions, drawn mainly from experience with the V-173 demonstrator, were generally positive regarding its handling. Testers praised its ability to fly at very low speeds without stalling, a feature that suggested unusual survivability in dogfights and during carrier landings. However, the heavier, armed XF5U would not have behaved exactly like its wooden predecessor, and it is doubtful whether pilots in combat would have enjoyed the same forgiving handling. Without real missions, these questions were never answered. Ultimately, the combat story of the XF5U is defined by absence. It was designed as a frontline fighter, armed and ready for interception and fleet defense, but history moved too quickly for it to take to the skies in anger. By the time it stood ready for trials, the jet age had dawned, and a piston engine flying Pancake seemed outdated before it could prove itself. What remains is the outline of a combat role that was planned but never executed. An aircraft intended to fight but left grounded by the swift advance of technology and the end of the war it was meant to serve in. The XF5U project, though short-lived, underwent several phases of refinement as engineers attempted to transition it from a wooden proof of concept into a frontline fighter. Each stage introduced new modifications, and while no operational variants were ever completed, the evolution of the design illustrates both the ingenuity and the limitations of the program. The wooden V-173, the flying pancake prototype that flew successfully during the war, served as the foundation. Its performance, remarkably short takeoff runs, extremely low stall speed, and stable handling at unusual attitudes, convinced the Navy that the concept could be developed into something combat-worthy. The XF5U-1 was to be the operational embodiment of these traits, with robust construction, powerful engines, and heavy armament. This was not a mere experimental testbed, but a planned fighter ready to carry guns, radios, and equipment into combat. The XF5U's most significant planned variant was the F5U-1 production model. This was envisioned as a fully equipped naval fighter powered by two Pratt & Whitney R2007 radial engines, delivering nearly 1,600 horsepower each. Its armament would have consisted of 6 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns or 4 20mm cannon, all mounted in the forward fuselage to exploit the unobstructed firing arc created by the absence of a nose-mounted propeller. The production model was also expected to incorporate provisions for underwing ordnance, such as bombs or rockets, which could have given it a secondary attack capability. Weight and power, however, quickly became critical issues. The metal construction of the XF5U resulted in a heavier aircraft than the wooden V-173, and with military systems added, engineers estimated that its performance margins would be reduced. To counteract this, Vought considered further refinements to the transmission system to increase efficiency, but the complexity of the drivetrain was already causing significant delays. A hypothetical upgrade path included fitting more powerful engines or redesigning the propeller system to reduce drag, but none of these solutions advanced beyond paper studies. Several experimental ideas were also floated for specialized roles. One concept involved adapting the Pancake into a carrier-based night fighter, outfitted with radar equipment housed in a streamlined radome. Its stable, low-speed flight could have made it well-suited to night interception, particularly against enemy bombers. Another proposal was for a ground attack version, leveraging its short takeoff ability to operate from rough forward strips near combat zones. These ideas never received formal Navy contracts, but they demonstrate that the XF5U was considered as more than a one-role aircraft. Internationally, there was some speculative interest in Zimmermann's discoidal wing principle, though no foreign production or licensing was ever pursued. The end of the war and the emergence of jet propulsion made further development impractical. By the late 1940s, no foreign air force was willing to consider adopting an unconventional piston-driven aircraft when jets were already becoming the standard. Technologically, the XF5U introduced features that were ahead of its time. Its structural design distributed loads across a lifting body, a concept that anticipated elements of blended wing-body research decades later. The counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque issues and maximized lift efficiency, ideas that resurfaced in later prop fan and advanced turboprop studies. Its propeller jettison system, similar in principle to that tested on the Curtiss XP-55, reflected a growing awareness of pilot safety in unconventional layouts. Despite its promise, the XF5U never advanced to true production or operational variants. The Navy canceled the program in 1947 before the prototype even flew, deciding instead to direct resources to jet fighters. The completed airframe was destroyed in 1948, ending any chance of further exploration. Only the wooden V-173 survived, preserved as a rare reminder of the experiment. The technological evolution of the XF5U therefore remained largely theoretical. It demonstrated pathways for future innovation but produced no lasting operational models. Its variants existed mainly in design studies and projections rather than hardware. What the project truly left behind were ideas about lifting bodies, propeller efficiency, and pilot safety that would later reappear in the jet and prop fan eras. It stands as an example of how even an aircraft that never flew can contribute enduring lessons to aeronautical progress. The legacy of the Vought XF5U, though tied to failure as a frontline fighter, extends far beyond its incomplete prototype. Its story is emblematic of the transitional moment in aviation history when piston engines were reaching their technological peak while jet propulsion was beginning to dominate. The Flying Pancake did not change the outcome of the Second World War, nor did it influence combat operations in the late 1940s, but its unusual design and the lessons it provided ensured it a lasting place in both engineering and cultural memory. Globally, the XF5U was viewed as part of a wave of radical experimentation that characterized the closing years of the war. Nations across the world were struggling to extract more performance from piston aircraft, even as jets emerged. Germany fielded jet fighters like the Me-262 and began testing flying wings, while Britain and the Soviet Union worked on their own jet prototypes. Against this backdrop, the XF5U represented America's willingness to explore unconventional solutions to naval aviation's most pressing challenge: how to combine short-deck operability with the speed and firepower of land-based fighters. It was not a successful combat aircraft, but it showed that the U.S. Navy and its contractors were unafraid to consider designs that defied convention. Its most immediate influence was in research. The data collected from the V-173 and XF5U programs deepened understanding of lifting body aerodynamics and the effects of large, slow-turning propellers on airframe stability. Although jet propulsion quickly eclipsed the need for such studies, elements of Zimmermann's concept reappeared decades later in projects investigating blended wing-body aircraft and advanced prop fan propulsion systems. Engineers recognized that while the Pancake was a dead end in its own time, the principles it embodied remained relevant in new contexts where materials, engines, and control systems could compensate for the difficulties that doomed it in the 1940s. Culturally, the XF5U became one of the most recognizable failed aircraft designs. Its flat, disc-like silhouette ensured it a place in aviation literature, often alongside other experimental oddities such as the Northrop flying wings or Germany's late war projects. Model kits, technical drawings, and later digital flight simulators revived interest in the aircraft, transforming it from an abandoned prototype into a subject of fascination. For many enthusiasts, the Pancake symbolized the daring creativity of the wartime era, when engineers were free, sometimes encouraged, to push ideas to their limits, even if they never reached production. The destruction of the sole XF5U prototype in 1948 marked the end of its physical existence, but its wooden predecessor, the V-173, survived. Restored and displayed at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, the V-173 allows the public to see the form that inspired the XF5U. Visitors often remark on its resemblance to futuristic or even science fiction designs, a testament to how far ahead of its time Zimmermann's concept appeared. This preserved airframe ensures that the Pancake remains a tangible part of aviation history, not just a forgotten project confined to archives. In terms of military doctrine, the XF5U had little direct impact, as it never entered service. However, it reinforced a crucial lesson for planners. Innovation must be measured against practicality, production capability, and timing. By the time the Pancake was ready for trials, the world had already moved on. The Navy concluded that resources were better invested in jets, which delivered superior performance with fewer mechanical complications. This decision reflected a broader doctrinal shift, away from radical piston designs and toward the new age of jet-powered naval aviation, a transition that defined the late 1940s and early 1950s. The Flying Pancake's global legacy, therefore, lies in its dual identity as a failed combat aircraft, but also as a symbol of innovation at the edge of possibility. It demonstrated both the potential rewards and the inevitable risks of pursuing unconventional designs. While it never fired its guns or saw service on a carrier deck, it endures as a reminder that progress in aviation comes not only from the aircraft that succeed, but also from those that fail spectacularly, leaving behind lessons and inspiration for generations to come. Beyond the technical reports and the official cancellation of the XF5U program, there exist lesser-known chapters that complete the story of the Flying Pancake. These fragments of history, often overshadowed by the dramatic rise of jet propulsion, reveal how the aircraft continued to influence thinking long after its prototype was scrapped, and why it still sparks curiosity among engineers and historians today. One of the more unusual aspects of the XF5U's history is the way it was abandoned. In 1948, with the Navy convinced that piston-powered fighters had no future, the nearly complete prototype was ordered destroyed. Instead of being flown for even a single evaluation sortie, the airframe was broken apart with wrecking equipment at Vought Stratford plant. For many engineers who had invested years in its design, this abrupt end felt anticlimactic. Test pilot Charles Lindbergh, who had flown the V-173 demonstrator and praised its handling, reportedly expressed disappointment that the larger Pancake was never given the chance to prove itself in the air. These forgotten perspectives highlight that the program's termination was not the result of a catastrophic failure, but simply of shifting priorities. There were also quiet discussions about adapting the Pancake's principles for non-combat uses. Some Navy planners suggested that its extraordinary low-speed control might lend itself to roles such as carrier onboard delivery, where aircraft needed to operate safely from cramped decks while carrying cargo. Others speculated whether the design could be used as a test platform for advanced propeller systems or radar installations. None of these ideas progressed, but they indicate that even as the program wound down, there was recognition that the basic aerodynamic concept still had potential value. In later decades, elements of the XF5U's design resurfaced in research programs exploring prop fan propulsion. The large, slow-turning, highly efficient propellers that had defined the Pancake were seen as precursors to advanced turboprop concepts of the 1970s and 1980s. Although the connection was indirect, engineers studying high-efficiency propellers often reference Zimmermann's work as an early exploration of how propeller wash could be integrated into the overall lifting surface of an aircraft. In this sense, the Pancake's unseen influence stretched decades beyond its destruction. The XF5U also developed a life in popular imagination. Its disc-like shape led some to associate it with early reports of unidentified flying objects in the late 1940s and 1950s. While there is no evidence that the Pancake inspired UFO sightings, its unusual silhouette fueled speculation that experimental aircraft might be behind some of the stories. Aviation enthusiasts often point to the XF5U as one of the few real aircraft whose appearance mirrored the flying saucer archetype, a cultural legacy that ensures its image remains familiar even to those with little knowledge of its technical background. From the perspective of the pilots who flew its predecessor, the V-173, the Pancake remains a what-if story. Their accounts consistently describe the wooden demonstrator as easy to control, forgiving at low speeds, and capable of maneuvers few conventional fighters could match. Many believe that the XF5U deserved at least a limited flight program to confirm whether these traits scaled up. That it was destroyed without flying leaves open questions that have never been fully answered, adding to the mystique that surrounds the project. Today, the preservation of the V-173 in the Smithsonian stands as the only physical reminder of this chapter in naval aviation. Visitors who see it often assume it belongs to a later era of experimental aircraft, or even to science fiction. The fact that it was designed in the early 1940s speaks to just how radical Zimmermann's thinking was. In museums, books, and digital media, the Pancake is remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it might have achieved, an unseen chapter of aviation where possibility and reality diverged sharply. The forgotten missions of the XF5U, therefore, were not flown in the skies, but played out in laboratories, design offices, and the imagination of those who encountered it. Its story continues to fascinate precisely because it was cut short, leaving behind both hard lessons in engineering and enduring speculation about what could have been if the flying Pancake had ever taken to the air. The final chapter of the XF5U flying Pancake story lies in how it has been interpreted and remembered over the decades since its abrupt cancellation. Though the prototype never flew, its radical design and the promise it embodied ensured that it would not disappear entirely into obscurity. Instead, it has come to symbolize the daring experimentation of an era when engineers were willing to defy conventional wisdom in pursuit of revolutionary performance. In historical perspective, the XF5U represents the last bold attempt to push piston-powered aircraft into realms where they might compete with the emerging jet age. By 1947, the inevitability of jet propulsion was clear, but Zimmermann and his team believed there was still untapped potential in radical aerodynamic solutions combined with powerful propeller systems. The Pancake was therefore not simply another prototype, it was a statement about what might still be achieved with creativity and engineering audacity. The fact that it was canceled before its first flight reflects less on the quality of its design than on the rapid pace of technological change that left it obsolete before it had a chance. In the years following its destruction, the XF5U became a frequent subject of analysis in technical and popular aviation literature. Engineers pointed to its lifting body concept as a precursor to blended wing body research that would emerge in the late 20th century. Historians placed it alongside other dead-end projects like the Curtiss XP55 Ascender and Northrop XP56 Black Bullet, aircraft that failed operationally but broadened the field of aerodynamic knowledge. For the general public, its disc-like form earned it a place in magazines, model kits, and later video games and flight simulators, often portrayed as one of the most unusual aircraft ever built. The Pancake's resemblance to the archetypal flying saucer gave it a cultural afterlife far removed from its military origins. When unidentified flying object reports surged in the late 1940s and 1950s, some speculated that experimental aircraft like the XF5U had contributed to the imagery of discs and flattened forms seen in the skies. While such links are more imaginative than factual, they underscore how the aircraft's silhouette captured the public imagination in ways few prototypes ever did. Its design looked futuristic even in its own time, and it continues to appear otherworldly today. Institutionally, the aircraft left behind one direct survivor, the wooden V-173, which after restoration became part of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's collection. Displayed for the public, it offers tangible evidence of the radical thinking behind the XF5U. For aviation enthusiasts, standing beneath its broad, flat wings is a reminder of just how unconventional naval aviation research once became. The destruction of the metal prototype deprived historians of a fully realized Pancake, but the V-173 ensures that the lineage is not forgotten. The broader lesson of the XF5U, reinforced through its legacy, is that failure in aviation does not mean irrelevance. The Pancake never entered service, never flew in combat, and never even completed a flight trial. Yet it continues to be studied for what it reveals about design philosophy and the boundaries of engineering. Its story demonstrates that ambitious innovation often collides with shifting priorities and technological revolutions. In this case, the revolution of jet propulsion swept away the last experiments in piston-powered extremes. Today, the XF5U stands as a symbol of both ambition and obsolescence, a fighter conceived at the edge of possibility but canceled before proving itself. Its historical importance lies not in victories or combat records, but in the reminder that progress in aviation has always depended on experiments that fail as well as those that succeed. The Flying Pancake remains a unique artifact of an era when the future of flight was still uncertain, and every daring concept, no matter how strange, deserved a chance to test the limits of what was possible. The enduring fascination with the XF5U Flying Pancake rests not only on its radical appearance, but also on the paradox it represents in aviation history, an aircraft that embodied both bold innovation and inevitable obsolescence. Decades after its destruction, the Pancake continues to attract analysis, speculation, and admiration, because it straddled the line between visionary design and technological dead end. Its story is less about what it achieved and more about what it symbolized at a time when aviation was undergoing one of its most rapid transitions. From an engineering perspective, the XF5U proved that unconventional approaches could generate valuable insights even if the aircraft never flew. The lifting body concept, in which the entire airframe contributed to generating lift, anticipated later research into blended wing bodies and advanced delta canard configurations. The counter-rotating propeller system was also forward-looking, aiming to maximize thrust efficiency and eliminate torque, at a time when powerful piston engines created significant handling problems. These lessons, extracted from the Pancake's design phase and its wooden predecessor's flight trials, were archived and later revisited in the context of modern prop fin studies and experimental aerodynamic research. The timing of the XF5U's cancellation ensured that its potential would remain forever untested. By 1947, jet aircraft such as the McDonnell FH Phantom and the North American FJ Fury were already shaping the Navy's doctrine for the future of carrier aviation. Against the backdrop of jets capable of exceeding 500 miles per hour, even the most optimistic performance projections for the Pancake looked outdated. This reality meant that the XF5U became a casualty not of its own shortcomings, but of a technological revolution it could not match. Its destruction without a single flight was therefore as much a symbol of the Navy's embrace of jets as it was of the aircraft's limitations. Culturally, the XF5U carved out a unique identity. Its disc-like form ensured that it was remembered as one of the most unusual aircraft ever built, frequently appearing in books and documentaries as a visual shorthand for experimental extremes. Its uncanny resemblance to the flying saucers that entered public consciousness in the late 1940s cemented its place in popular imagination, blurring the boundary between historical prototype and cultural myth. Unlike many forgotten prototypes, the Pancake became a visual icon of aviation experimentation, instantly recognizable even to casual observers. In museums and scholarship, its importance is framed as part of the broader R&D culture of the Second World War and its aftermath. The United States, like Germany and Britain, was willing to pursue high-risk projects to test new aerodynamic principles. While most of these designs never reached combat, they expanded the limits of what engineers understood about flight. The XF5U is often cited alongside the Curtiss XP55 and Northrop XP56 as examples of radical wartime concepts that, although failures, enriched the discipline through trial and error. The legacy of the XF5U also lies in its role as a cautionary tale about the relationship between innovation and timing. Even the most creative designs cannot succeed if they emerge too late or if they require resources that no longer align with strategic priorities. The Pancake was bold, but the Navy needed jets. It was innovative, but it arrived in a world already preparing for supersonic flight. As such, it serves as a reminder that the value of an aircraft is measured not only in its engineering ingenuity, but also in its ability to meet the practical demands of its era. Today, the XF5U lives on in memory, scholarship, and preserved artifacts like the V-173. It remains a subject of fascination precisely because it represents the road not taken in aviation history. The Flying Pancake reminds us that progress is as much about paths abandoned as those pursued, and that some of the most striking designs may leave their mark not through service records, but through the lessons they impart and the imagination they continue to inspire. The closing chapter of the XF5U Flying Pancake story is one of preservation, interpretation, and enduring fascination. Though the aircraft never took to the skies in its completed metal form, its legacy survived through the earlier wooden prototype, the V-173, and through the records, photographs, and engineering data that documented its creation. In many respects, the Pancake became more influential in its afterlife than it was during its short existence as an experimental project. The V-173, carefully restored after years in storage, today resides in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum collection, providing the public with a direct connection to Zimmermann's radical vision. Displayed alongside other experimental aircraft, it demonstrates the extraordinary range of design thinking that characterized aviation during the Second World War. Visitors who encounter it often react with disbelief that such a futuristic-looking machine was conceived in the early 1940s, at a time when conventional piston fighters still dominated combat. Its preservation ensures that the principles behind the XF5U are not forgotten, and that the story of the Flying Pancake remains accessible to new generations. For aviation historians, the XF5U has become a case study in the limits of innovation. It highlights the risks of pursuing radical designs when technological revolutions are already underway. The Pancake was canceled not because it could not fly, but because by the time it was ready, jets had already eclipsed its projected performance. This fact has made it a frequent subject in discussions about timing, strategy, and the importance of aligning research with operational needs. In this sense, the XF5U is remembered less as a failure than as an illustration of how quickly progress in aviation can render even the most ambitious designs obsolete. The Pancake has also achieved a kind of symbolic immortality in popular culture. Its unmistakable disc-like silhouette has appeared in books, documentaries, model kits, and flight simulators. Its resemblance to the flying saucer archetype ensured it a place in the broader mythology of mid-20th century aviation and popular imagination. For many enthusiasts, the XF5U represents the boldness of an era when engineers were unafraid to push ideas to extremes, even at the risk of producing aircraft that looked too unconventional to succeed. In the broader narrative of aviation history, the XF5U underscores the value of experimentation. It produced no operational squadrons, fought no battles, and scored no victories, but it enriched the body of knowledge that guided later engineers. Concepts like lifting bodies, distributed propulsion, and high-efficiency propellers all reappeared in different forms decades later, often supported by the lessons first glimpsed in Zimmermann's Pancake. The aircraft's destruction in 1948 marked the end of its physical existence, but its intellectual contribution endured in ways not immediately visible. The ultimate significance of the XF5U lies in how it challenges our perception of progress. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by the machines that succeeded, but also by those that failed. The Flying Pancake never entered combat or service, but it broadened the horizons of what was possible and left behind a story that continues to intrigue engineers, historians, and enthusiasts alike. In this way, its legacy has outlived many aircraft that did reach production, ensuring that the XF5U retains a permanent place in the history of aviation as one of the most radical designs ever attempted.